And honestly, in your independent contractor contract, you should have something about like the contractor promises to like not be negligent and not do this kind of thing. So it kind of all.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. I know we're a little bit later than normal, but we have something really special in store tonight. We are going to have Caroline Fox from Engaged Legal. And she's a lawyer. Hey there, BFF Jen Creations. Here she is. She's going to be talking about all things COVID contracts. And I know that you've probably already heard a lot about everything with COVID contracts. The difference really has to do with now that things are starting to open up, which insane that it's happening in some places and not others, and can be very confusing. There's a lot of conversation about waivers and things like that. So there she is. Hey, how are you doing, Caroline?
Hey, how are you?
Good. I love your earrings. They're fun.
Thank
They're
you.
very fun. Mine are just like regular studs, but nothing like special
I'm
fringe.
trying to keep it festive.
I love it. Hey, Jackie, Jordan, they joined. Nice to see you guys. So why don't you kind of tell me a little bit about like I know that as things are starting to open up, I think what is like the number one thing that you've been hearing a lot are people nervous. I mean, I've heard things where like people are like, it's opening up, but I'm really not sure that I want to dive right in. And others are
Yeah.
like, I don't care. Let me dive in. I just want to be protected. Like, what have you been hearing? Obviously, because you're talking to people all over the country.
Yeah, it's been I think the biggest question I get, and we can talk about it a little bit later too, just people keep asking like, "Oh, do I need a liability waiver? Like, what do I need? What I need do I need to make people sign something?" That's probably the most frequently asked question I'm getting. Aside from that, I think people are just like, "How do I make sure I'm doing what I'm supposed to? Like, what am I supposed to be
Yeah.
doing?" Because people are concerned and they want to make sure that they're not only protecting themselves but protecting the people that are there, and making sure that they're not stepping in any sort of liability issues at the same time. So those are probably the two things that I'm hearing the most about.
And so, like, I mean, obviously, it's a little bit different for every business, whether you're a beauty professional in like close contact with somebody, or if you're a venue and you're setting up and you have, obviously different contractors or employees that are setting things up, needing to sterilize and clean everything. I mean, what is the one thing? I know some states are really good about guidelines, they have everything very well spelled out, and others are kind of leaving it up to everyone to determine what they think is going to be best. What have
Yeah.
you what have you seen kind of as best practices, and what would you suggest to different pros in terms of what to do if their state does or doesn't have guidelines? I mean, what's kind of the best way to go about that?
Yeah, so when we talk about, okay, what should you be doing, what should you be doing based on your industry, what we kind of have to go back to, okay, so if something bad did happen, like what would that liability look like? And I mean, from a legal perspective, it's like, where would the root of that claim lie? And so the root would be, and we're getting like kind of in the weeds here, but the root would be in a type of injury, I guess you called tort law. And tort is not a cake, unfortunately. It is a cake, but not in this situation. It is actually, it's a form of wrongdoing, and it's kind of like when somebody actively does something to harm somebody else. Like you hit somebody, that's like a tort. So that's what we're kind of talking about there. And when we're dealing with torts and what we need to do and what we don't need to do and how we need to act, most of the time what we're dealing with are different standards of, are you negligent? Are you reckless? So that's when you think about like driving, if you're driving a car, there's like negligent driving, reckless driving, that kind of thing. That's the perspective that you use. So where this all ties in is we kind of fall into this place where we're interpreting things under like a reasonable person standard. So what would a reasonable person in your situation, in your industry, in this time period be doing? Obviously that's a little bit that's not really great, but we need to be thinking like, all right, if I'm just a normal person, pretend I'm a normal person, like what would I do here? I'm not normal. If I'm a normal person,
Totally
what would
normal.
I be doing? And then I tell people, like, then take a couple steps further, because then you really just want to be in the clear. So
Right.
think about, like, what are most people doing? What are the advisories? You know, you can look to CDC guidelines. You can look to industry best practices. You might belong to trade groups or something of that nature. And they might be saying, like, we're recommending you do this. We say do this. So kind of pull from different areas, pull from different, like, if your state is really, really still on lockdown like mine is, you know, maybe it's better to follow your state guidelines. If you are in a space where your state is reopening, look to your trade publications, look to experts in your field and kind of decide, all right, well, they're doing this. So for me, I'm going to do that. Maybe I'm going to go a little bit farther just to like CYA essentially. So that's what I'm telling people to do because we are kind of working on that reasonable person standard.
Right. And especially now, I mean, in normal old normal conditions, reasonable
Mm-hmm.
still a little, up in the air. And now it's like reasonable is like a totally different thing. Like you can't
Yeah.
even point what that is because, is it reasonable to wear a mask or not? Is it reasonable to, open up or not? Is it reasonable? Like there's so many things that we just don't know. It's
Right.
hard pinpoint what is reasonable. And so I think for a lot of pros, they're just like, well, how do I cover myself? How do
Right.
I
For
that like someone's not going to come back and like sue me or say that I was, had, bad, sanitation practices or hygiene practices, or I didn't make my employees wear a mask, or, how all that goes. And then on the
yeah.
flip side, in terms of like, how does that even, obviously I'm not a lawyer, so how does that even work? Like as an employer, if you have, I know that like if you have employees, you can require them to wear like a uniform and things like that. But if you have independent contractors, like and your state's not requiring people to wear a mask in that type of service or even just in general, is it out of line then for you to require independent contractors to have to wear a mask
Hmm.
or shield or gloves, or do you know what I mean? Like where
Yeah.
does of I guess draw like where do you draw the line on that? Where are you overstepping those boundaries?
Right. For sure. And I think that in a situation like this where it's a public safety concern, I think you have a little bit more leeway where with independent contractors, normally you're like, okay, well, I can't tell them to do this. I can't tell them to do that. I got to be really careful. But in a public safety situation where we're concerned about the safety of others and, you know, reasonable person standard, you want them to be acting reasonably. And honestly, in your independent contractor contract, you should have something about like the contractor promises to like not be negligent and not do this kind of thing. So it kind of all at the end it comes down to planning, which you know, you can't always plan for everything, obviously, but we give ourselves a little bit more leeway in instructing like, hey, you need to be wearing this, like you need to be wearing a mask, you need to be operating under these procedures because it's more of a public policy issue. Like you have different things that are butting heads in legal all the time, you know, like freedom of whatever versus
Right.
public policy versus all this other stuff. So, in situations, usually public health and public policy tend to kind of weigh out a little bit more and be like, all right, well, um, we're gonna say that this is gonna be okay for you to require people to do this because this is public policy and public health.
Right. Even if like, a year down the road, we find out that, like you can't get it for like it only lives for X amount of time on surface. So like there was no reason to have done that. At this point in time, we don't know that for
Right.
sure.
Right.
So our actions in terms of reasonable, like, it's of this time, not necessarily
Yes.
what
It's
could be later or
what
something.
is a person knowing all the information that you know right now in this situation, in this time? Like, that's what we
Okay.
base reasonableness off of. So, like, it's not like, oh, what would a person 2 years ago have done or what a person 2 years in the future have done? It's what is happening right now.
Right. That's really good. Okay.
A
And
little,
so in terms of like, you know, waivers and things like that, I know that's definitely one of those things that people are like, okay, do I have everybody sign a waiver saying they're not going to hold me liable if they do get you know, corona, if they are exposed, if, you know, because I mean, again, so many people had it and didn't even know they had it
Right.
and gave it to someone else. And unfortunately, that person might have gotten very sick or been in the hospital or died. I mean, those are very serious things. And so, where does a waiver come in? How is that helpful or not in terms
Yep.
of what venue, your um, a rental company, you're a photographer? How does that work?
As with many things in this specific COVID situation, the liability waivers are very state specific, so it's hard to give like a blanket, like, oh, your state allows this, or oh, your state doesn't. Like, I'm in Virginia, and Virginia doesn't allow you to sign over certain rights to waive certain liabilities by contract. They will always say, like, oh, if you jumped out of an airplane and the airplane parachuting whatever rental company, they didn't check for holes beforehand and they left those parachutes in the shed all summer with a bunch of mice. Like, I can't sign away my right to sue them for that, because even if they give me a waiver that says, like, yeah, you won't sue us for anything, like, that's reckless, almost like willfully malicious behavior. So I can't sign that away in Virginia. Now, there are other states where you can, or you can sign away a lot more, but not necessarily here. So when we talk about liability waivers, I will go on the record now and say, like, I'm not really sold that liability waivers are the answer, because first of all, your couple would have to have every person that attends that event sign a liability waiver. And this is a luxury service. And honestly, knowing the industry, you're not going to want to have everybody filing into a party celebration signing a liability waiver. Kind of kills the mood. I get that. Second, even if it you were okay with that and weren't like, oh, it kills my vibe, whatever. Second, it's going to be really, really hard to prove a case that somebody somehow gave you a disease, like, or a communicable illness, because it is like it that proving that causation, that causal connection, is so extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult in a lot of different situations. I'm gonna sneeze. Oh goodness, excuse me. It's difficult in a lot of situations. Now, that doesn't mean that people can't attempt to sue you. I'm gonna go on, like, people ask me all the time, like, can somebody sue me for this? They can try. They can try to sue you for that. Whether they will be successful or not is another question. Now, the issue then will become, can I prevent someone from trying to sue me? Maybe, depending on your state. And that's where you get in that gray area where it's like, oh, I don't know. If you are bringing people, if you know someone is ill and you bring them into work and you bring them to do an event, knowing that they have what probably is COVID or COVID symptoms, that could be maybe considered reckless behavior, and maybe you can't sign that away in your state. However, does that mean you have to then, like, take everybody's temperature when they come into work? Does that mean you have to? We don't know. We don't have guidance on it yet. So the point of all this is, I don't feel confident telling people, like, yeah, a waiver is going to protect you. I just don't. Um, just because I know how it works in other situations, and being in a very legally conservative state, like, I don't think that it's going to help many people where I am. In certain states, it may help you. It
Okay.
may be helpful, but I can't confidently say, like, yeah, that's a great idea.
Right. And I mean, I've heard, especially specifically for like beauty services where like they have to be physically within, 6 feet to do the
Mm-hmm.
service. In those types of situations, do you feel like that is a valid thing to have a waiver or not? Because, it's one thing if you're sanitizing a venue space and like maybe someone didn't actually do the job and they said they did, or you check, whatever. But if you're performing a service I mean, even with a mask and even with everything, like, yeah, like you're breathing in the same air.
Yeah.
Um, so like, is that a type where it's like they could potentially sue you if you don't have a waiver, or would the waiver protect you? Or again, is it totally state by state?
So in that situation, I tend to write into my beauty contracts anyway, like, hey, we do our best to best practices, try not to do anything, that kind of thing. Um, that I write into all those, that kind of like a waiver in that way.
Okay.
Um, in this situation, I mean, I don't think it's going to hurt you at all. I don't know if it's going to completely protect you. I think what would be a good idea, especially for people who are like in that nature of the service, is to put something in there like, you acknowledge that, like, we are in the middle of a global health crisis, like, initial everything that I'm saying, that's definitely not going to hurt you.
Okay.
What I don't want to do is, I don't want to give people a false sense of security saying, yeah, you're fine, go ahead. Definitely not going to hurt you. Probably only, I mean, it's only beneficial to you, especially if you're in that up close area.
Right.
So adding something like that is not going to hurt you. It just might not help you, and it might not keep you out of trouble the way I think some people think it might.
Right. And if anything, I mean, whether it's you're a beauty service professional or you're a rental company, I would assume that having people, when they're signing a waiver, they at that point, it's more about like their acknowledgement of the
Mm-hmm.
fact that they're aware that while you're going to do everything within your power, like it's I mean, in effect, them saying, yes, I get that you can't
Right.
totally protect me from potentially getting something that you might have, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like,
And that goes to like a worst case scenario. Like, say we do end up like in court, say we do end up like whatever, you can at least show that they were made aware of the potential and they like actively acquiesced to that. So
right,
those
right,
are all good things to do if we're looking at worst case scenarios, which we might be. And I try not to be so like grim reaper, bearer of bad news, like negative about things, but you have like, and I try to be more preventative in my approaches, and in the preventative way, I don't think it's as helpful as people may think it is. But on the back end, in the, okay, we're in litigation, someone went crazy and is suing us, it's only beneficial to have an acknowledgement saying like, we said this, they agreed to this, so we told them what our procedures were, we follow them to a T, that kind of thing. But again, make sure you are in the same vein. Make sure you're being reasonable. Make sure you're following the best practices. Make sure you're following guidelines if your industry has any, because that's just going to like stack up on that reasonable person standard. And you're going to have all these different ways to kind of say like, we did this, we did that, they did this, and try and insulate yourself as much as possible.
right. And in terms of, waivers, can those be done electronically? Like if you have like a DocuSign or something like that, where, it takes the IP address and it captures all of that. Can you have
Mm-hmm.
people, so instead of having people like line up and physically sign something, can they do that in advance? Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And file
Yeah,
that.
I love that idea.
Okay.
I think that's a great idea, honestly, that nobody's come up with yet or nobody's talked about yet, because most of the time I'm talking to people and they're like, yeah, I don't know how we get all the guests to sign, or I don't know how we get all the bridesmaid, whatever, blah, 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 except for just like signing it there. So I think that's a great idea. I mean, we're in a unprecedented time. So if you can get everybody to sign it, that's awesome.
Right.
Um,
At that, then it's like it's really straightforward. Like
yeah,
you don't have to have people, essentially waiting in line to sign using the same pen that everybody
God,
else, like
was
so.
they want to say. Yeah.
So I think you're right. It's really kind of trying to think outside the box, like what, and it's not just like what do I have to do or what's the least amount, but it's like what can I do? And I think that's
Yeah.
really what a lot of pros are at, wondering like what else can I do? Because I want to. I mean, I don't think anyone, hopefully, wants to actually communicate the disease to someone else. You know what I mean? So it's not
Yeah.
like, oh, we're really trying to, like because we don't care.
Yeah.
Um, so, on the other side of where I think a lot of people are, it's really figuring out like what are those additional things. So besides obviously waivers, things like that. What are some other ways, like things that they can add in their contracts or things they can do to help protect themselves?
Right. And this is another thing that I keep getting asked. And then as we move forward, it changes too. So I would say we're all at the place where we know we need a very strong cancellation and strong postponement clause. We know that. Everybody knows that. We've talked about it. I've talked about it to death. People are tired of hearing me talk about it.
Right, right.
I'm tired of talking about it. And also just really hammering in the payment situation, what is non-refundable, what's not, setting it up correctly, all of that. If you haven't heard me like beat these to death verbally yet, it's on the blog. Message me about it. I'll send you one of like 18 different. No one wants to hear this anymore. But moving forward, I think it's very interesting because when we talk about force majeure, and this is a conversation I had the other day, and trying to figure out where this is going next. When we talk about force majeure being our kind of situation and what got us into this current state and what has helped a bunch of people about rescheduling and all that, force majeure kicks in for unforeseeable events. Is COVID unforeseeable anymore? I don't think so. I think it's foreseeable now, which means that your contract needs to address it. So, and this is what I'm toying with too, and how to best do it is I think that now we need to have specific riders or appendices or whatever or clauses specifically addressing what's going to happen for COVID. Um, I think probably the way that I'm going to go about this is by making an addendum for it, its own little like Exhibit A, Schedule, whatever, Addendum B. I think that that's how I'm going to do it. It's interesting to kind of think through if you are signing new contracts, that is what you need to think about moving forward. Like, is it unforeseeable anymore? No. Like, now that we're in it, anything moving forward, we could have foreseen it happening.
Right.
So I think that we're going to have to start putting stuff in. I mean, if we have not figured out how to deal with this yet, I don't know if we're going to figure it out in the next however many months too. So I think that we need to start figuring out, all right, well, how do we put it in our contract? And do we want to offer specific terms or postponements or reschedule options for people who are now affected by a global pandemic that we know about,
Right.
but it's a pandemic. So,
So, and then tied to that, what about the next? We don't know what it could be, but it could be something like COVID or worse.
right.
Um, would would that be then covered in that type of a clause, or would that have to be would that be covered under the unforeseeable clause, or would that, like, how does that work? Because I mean, I think on one hand, we don't know a lot about COVID and we're still learning. And
Right.
so the hope is that, within the next couple of years, it's going to be like the swine flu where it's like overdone, we're good, we're all set, right? No problem. But if it's not, that's one thing. And then if it's something totally different, what do we do at this point to make sure that our contracts are covered for that pandemic type of
Hey,
situation? And what if it's, and on the other kind of the far side of that, what if that is a pandemic issue that maybe doesn't affect your ability to do the work you've been contracted, but it affects their ability to have their wedding or the
mm-hmm.
wedding want? At that point, would that fall under whatever it is that's added into the contract?
There's a lot of different questions and they're all really complex ones. I will say first, so what does this mean moving forward? I mean, it's interesting because like we don't have guidance.
Right.
Obviously, the first thing we've dealt with in this capacity. So I am wondering, and I'm wondering as it plays out, and I think we're gonna have to see again how it plays out in court, where all the great legal scholars will be duking it out in appeals and all of that. And I wonder, and again, I'm still working through this myself. I'm still researching and looking up case law and talking to other lawyers and seeing what they think, called professors of law from all over to try and figure this out. Um, do we think that this is going to be in the future? Do we think, is it going to be unforeseeable? Maybe it's the same COVID type resurgence, a second wave, something like that. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if I think so or not. If it's another outbreak of illness based on the past outbreaks that we've had that have gotten bigger and bigger and worse, is it then unforeseeable? I don't know. Maybe it
Right.
is. But that's something that I think a lot of really great uh, legal scholars up in the judicial system are going to have to kind of hash through. Now, I think your next question, there were a few. What was your last question?
No, so in terms of kind of how that all plays out, like would essentially how do you, or if you need to add anything additional to your agreements or your contracts, um, to essentially cover you before something else happens? Like, what if it's not COVID? What if it's something else?
Mm-hmm.
Because at this point, we are, I mean, we're potentially just thinking that anything could happen. Like, there could be another something else and it's not COVID. So is that covered in the unforeseeable or not? And if it's not covered in unforeseeable, is there some type of language that should be included in your contract to cover that? Or is it just not, you're not able to cover it because in theory it's unforeseeable, but because we're kind of living in this anything could happen era, you know,
Mm-hmm.
nobody
Yeah.
knows.
So I think at this point we can foresee, I think it would be considered reasonable to say like, oh, it's foreseeable that there will be another medical situation like this maybe sometime in the future. Maybe
Right.
that's maybe. I mean, I think it is personally. Like, I think like, all right, well, this has happened, so now I'm going to plan for it moving forward.
Right.
Like, I'm also from right outside Charlottesville, where we had that crazy riots and like all that stuff. So now in all of my contracts, I plan for civil insurrections, and I will forever. So, I think that your best bet, because there is no such thing as a bulletproof contract, there is no such thing as like an ironclad contract. If anybody ever tries to tell you that or sell you that, like, they don't exist. And that's why we have litigation. That's
Right.
why like companies like GE with their 8 million lawyers get sued or like lose, because there's no such thing as a perfect contract that can foresee every single thing. So in those situations, that's why we have force majeure clauses that kind of think about all these, like, here's random stuff that we can't really plan for, that we want to make sure that we have covered. So that you have that force majeure clause to kind of be your like net and soften your landing a little bit. But also, again, just planning out through your postponement clauses, when they can postpone and what they can postpone for, and if there's any additional cost to that. And then your cancellation, if they don't check with you in advance when they reschedule, that's considered a cancellation, and then they owe you X, Y, and Z. So just being kind of, what is everything that can go wrong here and how can I fix it? Which, I think I'm a generally positive, upbeat person, but like my job really just consists of me looking at everything and being like, this could go wrong and this could go wrong, this could go wrong. So it's like a really strange, like,
Right.
dichotomy we got going on. So doing that and then just zipping up your contract as much as possible too. Because I also think that when we are in situations like this, it does seem so like end all, everything's exploding. And for some people, yeah, it's rough. There are some tough things happening right now. I've got litigation that I'm going to be going into, unfortunately, but there are worse things that could happen.
Right.
At the end of the day, there are worse things that could be happening.
Right. Right. And in terms of, so the other question that I had was, okay, what if another pandemic happens, whatever, and you are not unable to do your job that's been
Mm-hmm.
contracted,
Right.
but they choose, based on whatever has affected them. So maybe it's a pandemic, but it hasn't, and it's, it's not affecting you doing your job, but it's affecting maybe their guests coming, and so they want to schedule. Does that fall under kind of that umbrella? Like they're able to essentially cancel or postpone based on whatever decisions that they want, or is it? Maybe I'm not asking that
Yeah,
correctly.
no, I think that I think I mean, so I have a flow chart for this. I made a flow chart because I'm a visual learner. It's on our blog.engagelegal.com. You can find it. It's like the COVID flow chart. Because it's so fact specific and so situation specific. Like if they are in, I mean, I'm in Virginia still, where like you can have an event, but it's a highly modified one,
Mm,
and it's going to depend what your contract says as a contractor. I mean, do you have agreed with them that you're going to provide those services? The fact that they maybe can't or are limited on what can be done at that point, that technically doesn't really matter unless there's something in your contract, the contract that you guys signed, to change that. I mean, that's why we have those force majeure clauses to protect you. If you are like, hey, I don't want to be here, there's a government pandemic, and they're going to find me and give me a misdemeanor for showing up, Virginia, or to protect them if things need to move, if we need to be flexible, things of that nature. So that's why we have those clauses in a contract. But I mean, contrary to contracting around it, there are a couple state theories called the theory of impossibility and impracticability that have been getting thrown around a lot. And that means if it is actually like, it doesn't mean it's harder, it's more expensive, it's less fun, it's a reduced guest count. That's not what those doctrines address. They address like, this physically cannot happen. There is no way this can happen. The venue has burned down. There has been a meteor strike and the venue is gone. Like the person is dead. That kind of situation is where those doctrines are going to kick in. It's very, very difficult to get those doctrines, and they're common law doctrines. So they're not necessarily written into code anywhere. Georgia, I think, though, does have, is it Georgia? I think it's Georgia. There are some states besides Georgia that do require you, the other party to a contract, they do require you to do what's called mitigating damage. And so that means you need to kind of like do what you can do without obviously injuring yourself or incurring more costs or damaging your own business.
hmm
Let's do what you can do to kind of help them out because this situation sucks. Like literally that's what it says. So you as the other party to a contract that is getting moved, canceled, whatever, need to at least in certain states need to mitigate those damages
hmm
by, if you're a florist, canceling the floral order if you can. If you're a caterer, not just
Right,
ordering that you don't have to order, things of that nature.
right. That makes total sense. And in terms of, I guess, kind of what people are doing for their contracts, like things that you've been hearing, like feedback wise, other pros, um, have a lot of them wanted to have more. Someone just said, please go into that more. We have people canceling
Okay,
way
yeah,
up all who, sorry, which is terribly unfair when bans will be lifted. It's personal preference at that point, and we've been flexible. It only hurts us as vendors. So like in that instance where, again, it's not that you aren't willing or able to perform the services, but they, for whatever reason, have chosen to reschedule. Um, I
your
guess,
contract should be address your contract should address postponements and what happens in case of those postponements, because what they're doing right there is just a normal reschedule that should
right,
be considered like anything else. It is a reschedule. You're not in a force majeure situation, so that doesn't kick in, so we don't have to worry about it. Now from a business perspective, because there's legal and business, right? There's always legal and business there, and well, PR too. We're all in there together. We're just all three in bed together. And there are those considerations where you're like, all right, well, if I don't if I'm not at least a little bit flexible, what is that going to look like for me? Or if I'm not trying to work with them, are they going to leave me bad reviews? Blah, blah, blah. And I mean, so kind of make those decisions by yourself too. Um, and it's going to be business by business what you do, because I've seen some people be really like, no, you shouldn't, always stick to your contract, never waiver. And the other people are like, oh, be more flexible. It's about what you want to do at that point. Whatever you do decide to do though, just get it in writing, because that's going to be important. But just in a situation where they're just canceling way out, that's just a postponement or a cancellation.
Right.
So whatever says in your contract about those, if you need to require a reschedule fee, if it's 30 days until the event and they're like, oh no, we're just going to postpone it anyway. And you're just like, well, 30 days out, you're supposed to pay me everything in full. If your contract is set it up that way and you have done it correctly and it's all ready to go, you should be, I mean, kind of like tough coconuts at that point, with obviously keeping in mind the business and the PR perspective.
So someone said, so Simply Blush Weddings asked, how would you handle a non-refundable deposit if someone cancels? So, I mean, and again, I think that goes back to what you were saying, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not just about, and I think this is a really important point that you made. It's not just about legally, like what can they do or what should you or can you do. It's about that PR aspect of your business and the business operations itself. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like if they're going to leave a bad review, what is that going to cost you in your
Right.
business later on? And is it worth it, discreetly giving them their non-refundable deposit back? I mean, how many times, especially in retail, I mean, I think that's one of those things that's just
Retail.
standard where it's like, oh, we can ask for anybody can, it doesn't matter if it's like, I ate all the chips here. I want a refund back, and they'll give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, is there anything else in terms of like, is there a more gracious way to be like, or a different way to, I guess, to phrase it so that it's, I guess people don't either feel like, yeah, I'm just a really horrible person because I'm not going to give it back to them, or, you know, how to kind of, be
Phrase it
able to,
all.
yeah.
You know, if I had the answer to this, I would be so rich. I would no longer be lawyering. I would just be hanging out. No, I'm kidding. I love it. But this comes to one of those situations where you have to be a business owner and you have to make the decisions and have the tough conversations. And I don't think anybody said it was going to be easy. And this is one of those situations where it's like, oh yeah, we're doing the hard stuff in business now. Like there's no easy way to tell someone, hey, I did this. I mean, well, one way to do it is to show them, be like, because we did this, and this, and our contract says this, and this, no, we're not refunding you. Not everybody has that. Not everybody tracks time. Not everybody sets up their contract correctly, I guess you could say. But I think it's important to remember that this is not a conversation that anybody wants to have. And I mean, as a lawyer, when advocating for my clients, I'm great at advocating for other people. I've won awards. I love it. I'm just like, no, you are not accepting that. But when it comes to myself, and I mean, complete honesty, when it comes to myself, I'm terrible. So I feel pain. Like, I feel your pain in saying, like, this is an awful conversation. I don't want to have it. But you're not alone. I'm just saying, I just want people to know, like, you're not alone. It's a hard conversation to have about when it's about yourself. Because I mean, how many people are ready to like go after somebody for their best friend who's, ex is treating them badly, but then it comes to you and you're just like, oh, it's fine. It's the same thing.
You're 1,000,000% right. And I think that's one of those, I think it's, obviously it's easier to see the injustice or the right answer or the right way when it's not yourself. When it's yourself and you're so entwined in everything that's going on,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard. And I
Yes.
also think that, your ideal client and the clients who are your clients who are asking for their refunds are going to be different than somebody else's clients who are asking for refunds, because your service, your product might be different than theirs. And even though you're in the same, part of the industry, or you provide the same type of service, doesn't
Yes.
that, oh, well, they're doing non-refundable, so I should do a non-refundable, or it's okay if they don't give back, and because I'm not going to give back, when
Yeah.
it's totally different client and customer. Because at the end of the day, this is like the worst conversation that anyone ever wants to have, which is why lawyers get paid big bucks, because nobody wants to have those conversations, and no one wants to have those, like, have to like think through all those crazy things.
Right. Right. And
So, and
you
like,
know, it's really interesting that you said that, and it's so on point because like even different like categories within the industry, on when I'm talking about like law firm stuff, if I'm working over at on law firm side, I have my lawyer hat on. My conversation with photographers is very different than the conversation I have with wedding planners. It's very different than the conversation I have with caterers or florists. Like there are certain areas are more difficult to deal with and harder to deal with. Certain echelons and like areas and certain types of clients are harder to deal with too. So um that's so on point. That's so on point.
I mean, because it really does depend. I mean, nobody wants to have that, like, penny pinching client who's like, oh, can I get a refund for this? And can I get a refund for that? And what about this? And I want a discount on that. Like, nobody wants that client. But if that is a quality that maybe is part of your ideal client, then you need to know that and have the contract that suits that.
For sure.
Um, or else you do have to deal with those really uncomfortable conversations over and over and over again. Um,
Luxury market clients are, while people might see them as like, oh my gosh, they're like they want everything a perfect way and they're going to scream at me and blah, blah, blah. A lot of times the luxury market clients, they're not the ones that cause the huge issues. I mean, not every luxury market client is going to be like a cakewalk by any means, but the issues that I have had and that I've ended up in litigation for on the law firm side are not with luxury market clients.
that is a really good point. Yeah. And I think it's, when you're talking about $500 to someone who maybe makes $50,000 versus someone whose wedding is $500,000, to them, $500 isn't a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so even thinking about that, like when you are thinking about your ideal client, really understanding, okay, what are going to be those points that I need to make sure are in my contract? Is this an appropriate amount for a non-refundable deposit? Is this something that, and again, while everyone's like, oh, I want to be I want to be in the luxury market and I want luxury weddings and I want clients who, yeah, we said this in a post recently. Everyone's like, oh, my ideal client is someone in their 20s and 30s who has lots of money and just trusts everything that I say they should do, has lots of money to
Same. Same.
but that's not really an ideal client. That's just basically someone who has money to burn, which
Yeah.
again, could be a total mess. You have no idea. Like maybe not. Like maybe it would be great, but generally speaking, like you should know them so much better so
Mm-hmm.
that yes, you might not have certain problems, but you might have other problems, and
Yeah.
it's always a give and take.
Toss up. It's toss up. You never know.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much for coming on and kind of sharing all your little tidbits. I mean, so much information and so much good stuff. In terms of like any last thoughts, that if you could say like one piece of advice that you would give pros, what would that be in terms of kind of legal advice for planning for the future things?
So the legal advice well, the not legal advice, I guess, I give to everybody is look through your contract and just be as specific as possible, like measurable things. Always dig down and try and just like peel off layers and layers and layers and say like, okay, well, can I go deeper? Can I be more specific? Can I be clearer? Because Brene Brown said, a client told me this, Brene Brown says, clear is kind. And I 100% believe that. The clearer you can be with your clients, the more they understand your contract and the more they trust you. And I think that that is the best way to serve them in general. And then for just general business advice right now, literally just keep putting one foot in front of the other. That's all you can do right now. Because in the end, the businesses that succeed are the ones that just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that exactly what you said, clear as kind. I mean, if we, I mean, we all know that, you know, when we assume, we make an ass out of you and me. And so, you know, if you have less for them to assume, you are only trying to save both you and them from looking like a total ass. That they should be mind readers, and so should you. Like that's ridiculous. And
It's
so
your
I
professional to guide them. So it's part of your job to address those points in the contract. If they don't like the terms, they can either walk away and like find somebody else, and then they're not your ideal client, or they can ask to change them. And you
totally
can say yes or no, and then you're good.
right, right. And I think that's, you know, remembering that a contract is something that you're creating for your business and for your clients because you want to serve them. This is not just like, how can I get over? And hopefully your ideal client is not going to be someone who's like, I want to try to get over.
I'm like in my parking lot, and I'm just like, what just
I
happened?
love
I
it.
don't know.
There's somebody walking. We should like have them come on. That was awesome. I love it. That's so funny. Well,
It's been a long day.
FF Jen said this is so informative and some great direction. I'm so glad. And I know Jordan from A Good Day Inc. said this was fantastic. Thank you. Joie de Vie Events said, and just because they have money to burn doesn't mean that they're going to lose it. They're not going to lose it over $5, which is
That is very true.
a million% true. Simply Blush said, very good insight. Thank you. And this is, I think, I mean, seriously, you need to know who your ideal client is. And if you don't understand who that is, first of all, just DM us. We have a worksheet for you because you need to know who that is. It's so important. And understanding that your contract is another part of your business that is there to serve your clients. And I love that. Clear as kind. Because it is. You're so right. And that's, again, thank you so much for helping us be more clear and more kind.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me come out and chat with you guys.
Love it. I love it. I love it. Well, have a wonderful night. You made me laugh. And wonderful, fantastic information. So if you guys have more questions, you can find Caroline. It's at Engaged Legal, right? For
Yep.
Instagram.
Yep.
Your website, it's engagelegal.com. Super easy. Like she said, there's tons of good blog stuff. I'm going to go find that flow chart, and I'm going to screenshot it, and then I'm going to put it up on our story. So if you guys have questions or you guys can kind of see what we're talking about. So
it's ugly. Awesome. It's really ugly. I'll say that. It's not cute.
It's not meant to necessarily be beautiful, and that's okay. We could probably,
it quickly, but it gets the job done. So
that's all we want. That's all we want. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Caroline. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.